Hello, in this lecture we're going to continue our discussion of work and the labor market, chapter 17. Remember that the goals are to explain how the supply of labor is determined, explain how the demand of labor is determined, that's where we're going to start off in this lecture, explain how wages are determined by both the supply and demand for labor in combination with social forces, contrast four types of discrimination that occur in labor markets, and summarize the evolving labor laws and implications of the labor market analysis for you. So the derived demand labor. So we have our demand curve here, and it looks like a typical demand curve. It's sloping downwards. The difference being that, just like in the supply curve, our axes here, the y-axis is now the wage rate, and the x-axis is the quantity of labor. So remember, when we're talking about labor, we are talking about the supplier of labor being us, in this case, the individuals, the citizens supplying the labor. The demander of labor, who is demanding labor in this case, those are going to be the firms. The firms are the ones who are now demanding. So we're talking about demand curve here in terms of firms demanding the quantity of wages, of the citizens' wages. So what's going to happen, just like any type of demand curve, as the wages go up, then the quantity demanded is going to go down. So here's the quantity demanded, and here it is here. As the wage goes from here to here, then we demand less, or the firms demand less of the wages. That's going to be the typical demand curve. So now we're going to talk about factors that influence the elasticity of the demand for labor. So remember, when we think about elasticity, what we're talking about is how much a change in wages will affect or change the quantity demanded. How elastic is that relationship? How much does one change the other? And so four factors that influence the elasticity of demand for labor are the elasticity of demand for the firm's goods. So each individual firm, the elasticities for their goods will affect the relative importance of labor in the production process. So different types of things will have different importance of labor in the process of production. And of course, if the importance of labor is very important, then that's going to affect the elasticity. The possibility and cost of substitution in production. So there could be something else that we could do other than labor, possibly in some instances. The example most often presented would be that if the cost of labor goes up a lot, maybe it's possible to automate many types of processes, and in that way we could substitute. There would be substituting for the labor. The degree in which the margin product falls with an increase in labor. So remember that we have a diminishing returns at some point, so the degree in which more labor will have a diminishing return will affect the elasticity of the labor. So labor as a factor of production. The traditional factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So remember, when we think about things, we think about like a car or something like that. Oftentimes we think about the stuff in it, like the rubber and this type of stuff. But we need to remember that it also consists of labor and capital and entrepreneurship in there. The labor market includes labor and entrepreneurship, and we can picture what labor is. Entrepreneurship refers to the labor services that require a high degree of organizational skills, concern, oversight, responsibility, creativity. So these days of entrepreneurship can be equivalent to weeks and months of non-entrepreneurial labor, meaning the entrepreneurial labor is more of the critical thinking, the problem solving, the new ideas that are going to be out there. And if those things are not present in a production process, then the standard labor can take a lot more time. It takes a lot more labor if the production process is not efficient than if we had some entrepreneur type ideas, the skills to increase the efficiency of the production process. That is equivalent to a lot of other labor time. So equilibrium in the marketplace. So we have our standard equilibrium here. We've got our supply for labor, our demand for labor, and we will tend towards the equilibrium. So the market will tend towards the equilibrium in that case, and when that happens, we will then have our wage rate. That will be our equilibrium wage, and we will have our equilibrium quantity for labor, in this case, similar to our normal supply and demand analysis. So shift in demand. So just like when we talked about shift in demand before, now we're talking about shift in demand for labor. And the major thing that would shift demand would be technology both increases and decreases the demand for labor. Now, for a long time, there's always been this kind of argument throughout history that as technology goes up, then the need for labor will go down and no one will have any jobs. We're just going to keep on creating new things and no one will be working. But that's not necessarily true, because obviously that hasn't happened. Actually, the population has gone up and more people are working. So it's not necessarily the case that as technology goes up that the amount of jobs will go down. What happens is the jobs tend to change. So there will be a decrease in jobs in certain areas and generally an increase in jobs in other areas. So now we're going to take a look at some examples. So here we have our supply of labor, a demand of labor, and we have a wage that is set above the equilibrium price. So if we have a wage that is set here above the equilibrium price, this is the idea of basically a minimum wage, the minimum wage being set above the equilibrium price. What would be the effect in the classical model? That would be that, well, the supply for labor, the people like us that want to go work, if we then all of a sudden had the opportunity to work at a higher wage than what was before, then more people are then going to want to go into the market and work at that higher wage. On the demand side, remember the demander is the companies in this case demanding workers. They're probably going to demand less because the wages are going up. It's costing more to them. They might try to substitute or use other things in production like technology rather than increase workers or do what they can with less workers. The classical model would end up then with a shortage of jobs in that case. So the classical model would say that there would be a shortage of jobs in that case. Now, there's a lot more detail when we think about the minimum wage as well, because we need to weigh out the pros and cons of the minimum wage. When we think about the minimum wage, we got to think about the amount of people it's going to affect in the population and the added increase in their well-being in terms of the minimum wage for the people affected versus the loss in the well-being of the people that may not be employed in the case of the minimum wage. So when you talk about a big increase in the minimum wage, it's clear that it could have a negative impact because it will reduce the jobs. If you have a small increase in the minimum wage that's not too far above the equilibrium, then there's a question as to how big the impact would be. And there's also alternative ideas to the minimum wage. Some people would argue that the minimum wage and risking putting it too high or too low might not be the best option. There might be other options that could help supplement, of course, if the goal is to supplement low-income working, to supplement low-income households, then the other ideas out there, one of the major idea is like the earned income credit, which would be a way to supplement income for people that work, basically raising their income but not taking it out of the hands of the employer and forcing it to adjust the market, because that type of activity will adjust the market. So here's another example of the labor market in action. Once again, we have our supply and our demand curved. And if there is the effect of an increase in the supply of labor, so if there's more supply of the labor for whatever reason, if there's an influx in the supply of labor, then that would have the effect of shifting out the supply curve so that at any given point on the wages, there would be more quantity supplied. What would that do to the equilibrium price in the classical model? It would move the equilibrium price down to, of course, the new equilibrium, and we would have a new equilibrium quantity at the new equilibrium.